there is an element of feeling suffocated, policed, and humorlessness about the way this ideology is being imposed. You know, there was a time where each ethnic group had its stereotypes, but the stereotypes were also a source of humor. You kind of mocked yourself, but it was also, there was again, you know, you're making mockery of the stereotypes, and at the same time kind of acknowledging them. So to take a classical example, I have to always be careful because you're so much younger than me, how much you'll even, what quote unquote, cultural references I make that resonate with you. So in my generation, most of the comedians were Jewish. And one of the most famous was a fellow named Jack Benny, okay? So Jack Benny's public persona was he was cheap. So there's one of his most famous routines was, it was first on radio, but then when he would perform it on television, he made the transition. And so here is the story. He tells the story that he was walking down the street, and a mugger comes up to him, pulls out the gun, and says to him, "Your money or your life?" Jack Benny stands there, doesn't say anything, and the mugger says, "Your money or your life?" Benny does, "Hey, bud, your money or your life?" And Benny turns to the audience, rests his chin on his hand, and he says, "I'm thinking." So, you know, ethnic stereotypes were sources of humor, good-natured humor, a little self-mockery, and you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. And now you might say, well, it reinforces stereotypes and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I guess it does. So I think it's that sort of stuff, the humorlessness, the crudeness. I mean, when you read these woke testimonies, first of all, they're unreadable. I mean, they're literally unreadable. What is going on here? It's complete trash masquerading as theory. Now, let me be clear. I come from the Marxist tradition, and there was a period where in the 1970s, there was a fellow, the French, this guy, Louis Althusser, and they were structural Marxists. Who the hell knows what they were talking, who they were. They were unreadable, absolutely unreadable. I know that. So it's not as if my historic tradition was immune to that sort of stuff, this kind of unreadable, party-oriented, abstract stuff. Yeah, I know. But I would say the difference was you could still discern some intelligence behind this very wooden language. There was some intelligence. Now there's no intelligence. None at all. There is the consequences of the degrading of book culture, written word. There's none. It's completely vacuous when you read it. They use slogans, which are substitutes for theory. You know, everything is settler colonialism, patriarchy, heteronormativity. These aren't concepts. A concept, a real concept, and you know it from the sciences, a real concept is the product of a very deep exploration of an idea. These aren't concepts. They're just catchphrases. Very different. You know, Marx had concepts, mode of production, relations of production, forces of production. Do you know your bookshelf back here could be filled with books written on what does mode of production denote? What does relations of production denote? Those were rich concepts. But settler colonialism, heteronormativity, it's just completely vacuous, because the people who construct these terms are completely empty and vacuous. You take Ibram X. Kendi, anti-racist, and he describes that as being different than opposed to races. What's the distinction? Being anti-racist versus I can't remember his distinction. But they're so empty. And I don't say this glibly. I think I wrote a 60 or 70 page chapter on Ibram X. Kendi, going through every line.
That doesn't surprise me.
That he's empty, or that I devoted 70 pages. Yeah, because he had become a cultural phenomenon. If he had been irrelevance, then no, I wouldn't do it. But it needed to be investigated, whether there was anything there. Most people, if they're great writers, if they're really learned, they convey the concepts without any heaviness of language. I was fortunate in my youth to have as my mentor Paul Sweezy, who was the greatest living Marxist economist. Now, he had a great combination. He was also the editor of the Harvard Crimson. So he understood how to put deeply complex ideas into very readable prose. So even though, those weighty concepts were embedded in his prose, you never saw them. You never saw the weight, because he knew how to make it readable, and also, I had a number of mentors who were also, they weren't just first-rate thinkers, they were also educators. They were people of the left. They want to, I know these are trivial things, but when Marx's Capital came out, and then it was translated into French. Marx's Capital is not easy, especially those first chapters are brutal. Those first chapters are brutal. And when the French translation comes out, he's asked to write a preface. And in the preface, he says, "Nothing pleases me more than the fact that this book will now be available to the French working class." Now, this was a very formidable tome, Volume 1. But at the back of their minds, or I should even say the forefront of their minds, they want to reach people. They want to communicate. They want to, quote unquote, I don't particularly like the phrase, but I'll just say it, to enlighten. So they're always trying to reach. When you read you read Judith Butler, who is she trying to reach? Who? I don't think she even reaches herself. No, it's just gobbledygook. And there's a certain pride, a pride these people take in being, what's the word, where you can't, impenetrable. They take a pride in being impenetrable. Now, that itself, I know you may say, well, that's going too far. That itself tells me these people are not of the left. Because if you're of the left, you want to reach masses of people. That's your goal, your objective. The people in power, they have the money. They have the institutions. They have the organization. The only thing we have, speaking as a person of the left, is we have the numbers. We believe that we speak as, the slogan that came out of the Occupy movement, we are the 99%. We have the numbers, and we have a hope, not a certitude, but a hope that if you can organize the numbers, the 99%, you can change the system. But if you take a pride in the fact that you're impenetrable, then you're not a person of the left. Now, I know that might sound like an extreme statement, but I think it's correct. Now, I don't think Marx reached much of the French working class, but at least it was an aspiration. There's nothing that pleases me more than the fact that this book is now going to be available to the working class of France. I make a determined effort. Everything I write, to reach people, they understand what I'm saying. It's the same thing, by the way, as a teacher. You know what's the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher? There are two things. One, you believe you have something important to say and you want to convey it. And two, a bad teacher starts with him or herself. A good teacher starts with the students. That's where you begin. You're going through material and you're asking yourself, will this work in the class? Will it work? Will this passage resonate? Because let's say you're teaching Mill, Rousseau, Plato, there are 10,000 passages you can look at, right? They are rich. You have 10,000. So how do you decide which passage? Well, obviously one criterion is if this passage has significant historical significance. People always refer to Rousseau and pity, or they always refer to Aristotle and Plato and the Philosopher King. So you look, you have to teach concepts which have a large resonance. But even there you have a lot of choices. And then you have to look at the material and you're constantly asking yourself the question, will it work? With who you're trying to reach. But if you're writing in a prose that's impenetrable, you can't be a good teacher, and you certainly can't be a person of the left. There's a famous case of, the Harvard sociologist Talcott Parsons. And he was a very famous person of his generation. And he wrote in this Germanic prose, totally unreadable. And then along came this radical sociologist at Columbia University, and his name was C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills, he sits down and he writes this essay, and he takes huge chunks of Talcott Parsons, and he says, it could be basically the two sentences. And then he would take 3 pages and say, well, basically say 3 sentences. That you can, not in all cases, but in general, I have to be careful here because certain ideas are not so easily translatable. But as a first approximation, you can make these things accessible if you want to, if you're committed to it. And as a good teacher, you should be committed to it. And also, as a person of the left, you should be committed to it.